Eagles Entertainment.
Eagle Eye in the Sky is fueled by Gatorade, the official sports drink of the Philadelphia Eagles.
Anything that move, I don't care who it is. Let's go. Give me everything you got. Play fast, play hard. Let's meet these boys tonight in their house. It's party time. It's party time. Flan, here we go. Touchdown!
You are listening to the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast. Now here's your host, Fran Duffy.
That's right of the week, and we've got a decisive win to discuss as the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade, continues. I'm Fran Duffy, and as always, I think we've got a great show for you here on episode number 368. At the top of today's show, we've got Chalk Talk, where I chat with Greg Cosell from NFL Films so we can catch up and share our biggest takeaways from the Eagles' win over the Detroit Lions before turning our attention to this week's matchup. Justin Herbert and the LA Chargers come to town to Lincoln Financial Field. We're going to break it all down right here in that segment. Before we get there, though, just a couple things I want to make sure we hit on. As always, make sure you go on to our Apple Podcast page, leave us a rating, leave us a review. If you've got a question about this Eagles team, go leave it there, and we will answer it right away here on this show. Really appreciate everybody that has done that lately. Again, it's not just to answer your questions, but it also throws us some support as well, makes the show a little bit more visible for others looking for Eagles podcasts. Also, make sure you go check out some other football analysis content we've got here on our Eagles channels. Our All 22 review, that's going to be a video breakdown of a lot of the plays that Greg and I are going to discuss here on the podcast. I'm going to show all of that film over on the All 22 review. You could find that over on PhiladelphiaEagles.com and the Eagles digital channels, the Eagles YouTube page, as well the post-snap read, where I dive into the Eagles defensive front, the pressure packages, all of those things. I wrote about that over on PhiladelphiaEagles.com, so you can go check that out. And as well, make sure you go see the Journey to the Draft podcast. Everybody's going to be following along. Who are these top prospects? Who could be in play for the Eagles in the first round next year if they've got 2 or 3 first-round picks? Well, we're talking about that topic every single week over on the Journey to the Draft podcast. Make sure you go find that wherever podcasts can be found. That said, let's get this show rolling. Excited to talk through this big Eagles win over Detroit with Greg Cosell in Chalk Talk.
Let's get down to business. It's time for Chalk Talk.
All right, well, excited to chop it up here with Greg Cosell from NFL Films as he joins us once again for Chalk Talk here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. Greg, welcome back to the show, man.
Fran, good to be with you. Good to talk about an Eagles victory for a change.
Yeah, no question. It was a big one, a decisive win, as I described it at the top of the show. On both sides of the football, we saw some good things. And per usual, we will start on the offensive side of the ball. Let's go with the run game. Obviously, the Eagles running for over 200 yards in this game. It should just get your thoughts on the offensive approach and what you saw from the run game here in this game.
Well, I really liked what I saw from the run game. They put Jalen Hurts under center. I mean, you go to, I guess the possession that really stood out to me as very emblematic of this game, Fran, was their third possession.
Sure, yep.
They started the third possession with Hurts under center in 13 personnel and had 4 consecutive runs in 13 personnel. And just to go through them super quickly, Scott 8 yards on an outside zone strong run, Scott 6 yards on a split flow inside zone run, Howard 10 yards on split flow inside zone, Howard 4 yards on outside zone strong. And it was all 13 personnel and all Jalen Hurts under center. And to me, and we've discussed this, and this is just my personal opinion from studying football for a long time, as you know, is I think that's a run game in the NFL. I think it's very difficult to have a true run game when the RPO is the foundation of it. So I thought that third possession with Hurts under center in base personnel, it doesn't always have to be 13, but in this particular case, it was. To me, that was very emblematic of the game.
Yeah, and I think, too, the other big part of, when you watch that sequence of plays, obviously that led shortly after to a 13 personnel play action pass to Dallas Goedert for a nice chunk. So you talk about the run game and play action game working together there. But then the other big one was just looking at the running backs. I thought in this game, they were all of them were extremely decisive. There were not a lot of negative runs in this game. All these guys, whether it was Jordan Howard, whether it was Boston Scott, Kenny Gainwell late, even Jalen Hurts on some of those design runs, you saw decisiveness there. You saw the ability to follow your block, set things up, whether it was a zone scheme and those guys were kind of riding the wave, or if it was on some of those gap schemes where they just had to get downhill and play off a block. I thought those guys were just very decisive overall in this game.
Well, maybe O-line coaches or running back coaches would disagree with me, but I believe you can be more decisive when your quarterback is under center because you get a little bit of a running start. When you're in the shotgun, you're getting a standing start, and to me, you don't have the same momentum, velocity, and therefore decisiveness you get when your quarterback is under center. So I think it all goes together personally.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the offensive line, we saw some really good blocking up front, and that's typically the case when a team runs for 200 plus.
Well,
but we saw some good things from Lane Johnson.
I was just going to say, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I thought, it's funny you mentioned Mailata, but I thought the interior of this offensive line in this game really played well.
Dickerson was really good again. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought Dickerson was really good. I thought that Kelsey played really well. You still see his athleticism after all these years. I thought getting to the tackles now, I actually thought Lane Johnson, you saw his athleticism on a number of runs because that's one of his strengths, is he's a very athletic player. So overall, but see, again, I personally believe that this all goes together, Fran. I think when you ask your offensive line to run the ball like this, where they move forward and they play with cohesion and they play with some kind of synchronicity, I think you tend to see better O-line play.
Sure. And I think, and obviously when added reps gets to that as well.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that people don't necessarily think about. But when you run a lot of zone schemes up front, reps typically help that. You want, especially when you have new pieces along the offensive line. You have a new rookie left guard in there. You've got a first-year starter at left tackle. When you have those changing pieces up front, you could hit the sled every day. You can hit your teammates every day in practice. But when it comes to surfacing blocks and working in tandem with one another, that can be tough to replicate in a practice environment. So as the team continues to run more and more, I think we'll start to see it become even more and more efficient as well.
Well, and I think, again, obviously it was a game in which the opponent wasn't scoring any points, and we'll get to the defense, obviously. So hopefully this continues. I think it will help the overall offense. I mean, obviously you're not going to go through every week where the quarterback just gets 17 dropbacks.
Sure.
That's not going to happen in the NFL on a weekly basis.
Right.
But hey, every game is a different game. This game played out that way, and that's what happened, and it worked. And we'll talk about the next opponent shortly, obviously. But I think all that is a positive as we look ahead.
And then just looking at from the pass game standpoint, I think we're starting to see some concepts that clearly the coaching staff and Jalen Hurts feel really comfortable running, whether it's those sail routes with Dallas Goedert, some of those 3-level stretches with the over route coming from the backside. We saw Quez Watkins catch another one of those in this game. We've seen Devontae Smith catch those over the last couple of weeks. So there are clearly some concepts from a pass game standpoint that are starting to become staples with this offense as well.
Well, it's funny. They continue to work the same basic concept that we saw last week in the loss to the Raiders. Goddard as the intermediate receiver in what is essentially a flood concept.
Yep.
And against the Lions, they featured it off play action and with Hurts under center. And by the way, I think that helps Hurts quite a bit because it when you come off that, you're calling it for a reason and it's defined. So where you're going with the football based on the coverage. And I think that we've seen that. We've seen the backside flood concept where, we saw Goddard run the crosser from the backside. We saw the same with Watkins. We saw it from play side. So I think that this is all going to help Jalen Hurts.
Yeah, and typically when you're having those plays from under center as well, the timing can be a little bit more crisp as well.
I would agree with that.
Matching with the drop back.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%.
Yeah. So we'll continue to talk about that when we watch this offense here moving forward. Let's get into the defense. A lot of really good takeaways from the defense, but I'll let you kind of start this. From a front seven standpoint or a back seven standpoint, what kind of stood out to you more when you kind of sat back and had your takeaways from watching the film?
Well, I thought the front played really well, but let me talk a little more about the back end because I thought, and again, I don't know exactly how it's called, so this is just my film study.
Sure.
I thought they featured cover 3 as a foundation, but with some wrinkles this week. There was some boundary lock. There was man-to-man outside the numbers with zone match inside. I thought overall they featured more man-match principles in their foundational zone coverage concepts, and I thought they were really, really effective. There's a number of teams that do this in the NFL. For instance, when I talk about matching up outside the numbers, man-to-man, but playing zone inside, the Saints are very well known for that. I thought we saw some of that. So I thought we saw some wrinkles based on foundational zone coverage principles. And I thought that's a really good sign. We know that this team is not going to line up and play high percentage pure man. I don't think they probably feel really comfortable doing that for whatever the reason. But seeing a lot of these man-match principles within their foundational zone concepts, I thought was a really good sign.
So when you say man-match principles, help the listeners out from that standpoint. You mentioned, all right, maybe you lock up one side of the field from outside the numbers. Hey, this corner on the outside is going to play man. Everybody else, you're going to play 4-over-3 and kind of match the routes as they deploy. How else would you kind of describe?
Well, I would describe it this way. If we're talking about playing man on the outside receivers, outside the numbers, that's man. But then inside, you're not playing pure man, but you're matching routes that come into your area. So in other words, you're not dropping to a spot and standing there. You're dropping to a spot initially, but you're reading the routes. So you're matching up with a zone principle, but you're matching up to routes in your area. So the goal, of course, is that you take away some of those routes because you're matching them. So that's what I mean by man match. And then, of course, boundary lock is you can play a zone principle. That's the call. But to the short side of the field, you match up to the single receiver, the boundary X receiver. And if the back is offset to that side, you will also match up to the back man to man. So they did a lot more of that, I thought, anyway, from my sense of the study of the game. I thought they did a lot more of those kinds of things. And I think that's a positive.
Yeah, I thought there were a handful of times where you could see Jared Goff drop back and did not like what he saw from a picture standpoint. No. And I thought that kind of painted, to your point, where the coverage was outstanding. Those guys matched the routes well, forced the quarterback to either get to his next read in the progression or hold the ball a little bit longer, and it resulted in a negative play. So I thought from a coverage standpoint, that really showed up.
What you're always trying to do with a quarterback is you're always trying to make him have to think after the snap of the ball, because plays are called with an anticipation of coverage based on film study that week. So you call a play with the idea that, hey, we did our film study. Obviously, this is not what the coach says into the mic for the quarterback, but this is the premise. Hey, we did our film study. We're calling this play because on this down and distance at this point in the field, we know we get 84% such and such coverage. So the play's called with that in mind. So what you're trying to do defensively is you're trying to make the quarterback have to think after he takes the snap of the ball, because it happens really fast, as you know. And, Jared Goff, and he's played well in this league. We know he took a team to a Super Bowl, but he is a somewhat programmed pocket player. And if you change his worldview after the snap, you really slow down his process.
Yeah, and that's clearly something that the Eagles were able to do early and often in this game. Let's get to the defensive front before we get into. I guess kind of pairing off of that, I thought we saw the Eagles just be more aggressive overall with their pressure scheme. I believe they blitzed 10, 11 times in this game. You saw the pressures come from inside, pressures come from outside. But then not only that, just the overall aggressive nature. I felt like the linebackers pressed things a little bit faster downhill, both in the run and pass game. I thought just overall the approach was just a touch more aggressive than what we've seen in weeks past.
Yeah, well, they rushed 5 more than they did in any game this season. So they were clearly more aggressive in that regard. I think when you're winning up front, it makes you look more aggressive.
Makes more aggressive, sure.
And I think they won quite a bit up front. I mean, Ryan Kerrigan, I thought, actually had a really good game. He had 4 really strong speed to power rushes against the right tackle, Matt Nelson, which impacted plays. I thought Williams, the rookie from La Tech, had his best game overall.
No question.
Both as a run defender, and he had that bull rush for a sack where he just drove the center, Evan Brown, right back into the pocket. So he played extremely well. So overall, I thought the D-line was strong. Now, when that happens, as you said, Fran, your whole defense looks better.
Yeah. And I think that you mentioned Milton Williams, Josh Sweat. We talked about him last week. He had a number of really impressive rushes against the Raiders, and people will say, "Oh, well, it was a goose egg in the box score. It couldn't have been that good." Well, this week he saw a couple good rushes, and it resulted in a couple good sacks. And so, just seeing Josh Sweat continue to carry over his strong level of play, that defensive front in general just looked pretty good. And when you talk about some of those blitzes, what I liked too, we saw some cover zero pressures on 2nd and long. I highlighted one of those this past week over on the All 22 review where, it's 2nd and 12. Eagles send cover zero. That forces a quick throw. Darius Slay makes a tackle on the flat. Now all of a sudden it's 3rd and 7. And we've talked about some of the issues the Eagles have had into getting into some of those 3rd and long scenarios. Well, the aggression paid off for them in some of these situations where, maybe the ball was completed, but it was completed so short that you were able to help yourself for 3rd down. And so I think that overall the aggressive nature really showed up in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And the Barnett sack was the result of the Singleton blitz, as you probably recall that play where he blitzed. And I believe it was Swift that picked him up, but he kind of got to his knees and he forced Goff to move because Goff does not like people around him. So he moved, and that led to the Barnett sack. So the pressure was a factor in this game for sure.
Yeah. Overall thoughts kind of taken away from whether it's pass game or run game from those two linebackers. We saw a lot of TJ Edwards, a lot of Davion Taylor in this game. I thought both guys really showed up. I thought TJ Edwards had one of his stronger performances of his career.
And what was interesting to me is Edwards played a lot of snaps in the nickel, which we haven't seen a lot of. So, I think they're trying to mix and match. Look, we know that Wilson was a healthy scratch, so we know they've been searching for linebacker combinations. Obviously, people can say as they listen to us, "Oh, it's the Lions," and you know what? That's fair. But when you're not playing well yourself, you're looking for positives, and you're looking for your players to do what they're coached and to do it well. And there's no question that happened in this game.
I do think it's funny because typically the people that will say, "Oh, it was the Lions," won't say, "Oh, yeah, but that was the Chiefs' offense or that was the Cowboys' offense," or that it only works when it's the negative that supports you, not necessarily the opposite way. But I think those were some of the big takeaways for me from the defensive side. So. Let's now turn our attention to this matchup here against the LA Chargers, and a team that obviously a lot of people are very excited about. Brandon Staley, young coach. A lot of people are excited about Justin Herbert, one of the bright young stars in this league. They've put up a lot of points during stretches of this season, a lot of firepower on the offensive side of the ball, and some blue chip talent on defense as well. But let's start with that offense. And this is a team that has lost 2 straight games to Baltimore and then to New England this past Sunday. Interested to kind of get your elevator speech on what this offense brings to the link here on Sunday.
Yeah, it's an interesting offense because Justin Herbert at his best is in some ways, and this is a positive statement that I'm about to make, is some ways a little mechanical and robotic. When he's at his best, he drops back, hits the back foot, ball comes out. Drops back, hits his back foot, ball comes out. Now, at his best, he's somewhat of a rarity. There's not a lot of quarterbacks who are big, physical, with power arms, who are extremely accurate with their ball placement. He's like that when he's at his best. And we've seen his best most of the time, beginning with his rookie season a year ago. So not only are they a sustaining pass game, but they've also been a vertical pass game that can attack down the field. And we have not seen that really the last 2 weeks, but they've done that for the large majority of their games with Herbert at quarterback, with Mike Williams, who's having his best season, with Keenan Allen at times, with others like Jalen Guyton, guys who can run. Jared Cook still can attack the seam with speed. So when they're at their best, they're both a sustaining pass game and they're a vertical pass game. So that's something you have to be prepared for because that can happen anytime. It's happened more often than not. It just hasn't happened in their last 2 losses. But I would say there's a couple of issues that have slowed them down. Number one, they've had injuries along their offensive line, particularly on the right side.
Sure.
So they're playing with Storm Norton at right tackle, and they're playing with Michael Schofield at right guard. And those 2 guys are struggling. And the Patriots this past week really exploited that with the way they chose to pressure, with what they did with their fronts, with stunt concepts, and that really exposed those 2 players quite a bit. The other factor, Fran, as I finish my elevator speech here, is they don't really have any kind of consistent run game, either in terms of production or with volume. So you're asking a lot every week of Justin Herbert behind an offensive line that can struggle. So that's a tough way to go on a weekly basis.
And that's the thing. To your point, you talked about that offensive structure and the pass game element. I think when you look at the way that they would like to play, there's shades of what we've seen from the New Orleans Saints. Joe Lombardi comes over. He was the offensive coordinator with Sean Payton. And so you're going to get a highly structured, quick game, intermediate, a lot of bunch sets. They're going to try and do some things to create some stuff in the quick game. They have the talent to win in that part of the field, right? Keenan Allen is so precise with everything he does. And Mike Williams, he's that ball winner on the perimeter, right? So you've got some of those pieces, but with, as you mentioned, some of the issues that they've had along the offensive line that they've struggled to protect at times. So when they've tried to go and attack the intermediate area of the field or attack vertically down the field over these last couple of weeks, that has been a little bit of a struggle. That said, every single game, Herbert is able to make some of these alien throws and just say, man, like that throw should not be available at this point. The defense covers up everything front side. He's going to make an opposite hash throw on a deep comeback on the opposite side of the field. And it's like, man, like there's only a handful of guys in the league that could do that, but it's tough to sustain that over week to week to week to week.
But I think one thing that's interesting, they just played Bill Belichick and the Patriots. And, and Belichick's obviously brilliant. And Belichick went away from what he normally does. Normally, Bill Belichick will play 75% man coverage. He did not do that this week. He was much more multiple with what he did. And I think there's something to be taken away from that because he wanted, again, it almost comes back to what we spoke about with the Eagles and what they did. So they're capable of doing it is you want to make Justin Herbert. Keep in mind, Justin Herbert has about 21 or 22 NFL starts. Yep. He's still a very young player. We tend to anoint guys, and there's no question he has high level talent, but he's still a young player who's working through some things in any given week. So the fact that Bill Belichick chose to really be multiple with his coverage concepts, mix things up quite a bit, I think that says a lot about how you want to approach Justin Herbert in this pass game right now.
Sure. I think that makes a lot of sense. When you talk about some of the other weapons in this game, we talked about Keenan Allen and, just how much of a technician he is. Mike Williams, any fantasy football player out there knows both of these guys have been extremely productive. Austin Eckler, he's going to get his in the pass game, and they find different ways to get him the football. Is there another pass catcher, whether it's a tight end, whether it's a receiver, that has stood out to you watching this team over the last few weeks?
Well, it's interesting. A player we really like coming out this year is Josh Palmer. Caught a touchdown this past week late in the game. Yep. He doesn't play a ton of snaps, but I think he's an interesting player. And who knows, you might start to see more of him. Sure. I don't know what Brandon Staley and Joe Lombardi are going to do, but I think Palmer is a fascinating player. He's got an NFL body. He's about 6'1", 6'2", 210, 215. They have big receivers, and it'll be interesting how the Eagles choose to defend this because the Eagles don't have big corners other than Slay, obviously. Avante Maddox and Steven Nelson are not big corners, and there's big wideouts on the Chargers. So we'll see what the man zone mix is this week. We know that they're foundationally zone, but they have been trending toward playing a little more man. We'll see if that continues this week against these big receivers.
Yeah, I mean, Jalen Guyton is 6'1", Palmer 6'1". We know Mike Williams 6'4". Allen's a bigger receiver than people think. Jared Cook, a big part of that as a tight end. So a lot of big bodies out there catching passes from Justin Herbert. Real quick, the Eagles saw a rookie left tackle this past week in Penei Sewell with the Detroit Lions. They see another one here in Rashawn Slater, who was he was a top, I think he was the 11th pick overall out of Northwestern. Interested to get your thoughts on what you've seen from Slater so far. He's been impressive. Honestly, he's surpassed my expectations, even with what I've seen from him so far. With 7 games into his NFL career.
Yeah, I think he's been very, very good. I mean, every young player is going to have bad snaps here and there, but I think overall he's been extremely good. The one thing that stands out to me, and I haven't studied every snap, and there are offensive line guys out there that we both know that certainly know more than I do, but I would say from what I've seen, which is a good number of plays, obviously, is he does not really get off balance hardly at all.
No, I mean, very rarely.
And I think that's really, just a tribute to a number of things. Obviously, just maybe his pure athleticism, but his technique, his understanding of how to use his athleticism. I mean, there are guys who are athletic who doesn't show up as much, but he is rarely in recovery mode in pass protection.
No question. You mentioned that the left side of the O-line, Matt Filer, who they signed over from the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's had a nice season so far at left guard. Corey Linsley, they brought over from Green Bay. They did a full change along that offensive line this offseason. Some injuries on the right side have kind of prevented that from coming to fruition, but center, left guard, left tackle, good combo for them right now. They're going to try and lean on that moving forward. Let's get over to the defensive side. I'm Brandon Staley, obviously known for what he was able to do with the LA Rams last year, the number one defense by pretty much every metric out there. And they did outstanding work with the Rams. Interested to get your thoughts on this defense here with the Chargers and how it's come together. I know they've had some injuries at the second level, but thoughts on what you've seen from the Chargers so far.
Yeah, and I think they had some injuries this weekend too. So we don't know exactly who's going to play outside corner this week.
Yep, right.
As we're speaking on a Monday night, we just don't know that. But I would say that the one thing I've really taken note of watching their defense and Brandon Staley is he's become a little opponent specific. They've predominantly been a single high safety defense, predominantly. But depending on the opponent, like for instance, when they played the Chiefs, and obviously the Eagles were not the Chiefs in terms of their thematic and structural approach. So I doubt he'll do the same thing. But when he played the Chiefs, he played a ton of two-man coverage, for instance, and it was pretty successful. So he's shown that he will be opponent specific with his coverage concepts. So and again, because you have the Jalen Hurts factor as a runner, I think you certainly won't see a ton of too high unless they just show that and take someone like Derwin James, who we'll get to in a second, and have him really drop down at the snap of the ball to try to, be a factor based on disguise. But they've struggled at times to stop the run. I wouldn't say they've just been shredded, but they struggled at times. So we'll see how the Eagles approach it this week.
I think that the two big things, too, when you talk about that defense and what they do from just a pure coverage shell standpoint, while they do play a lot of single high, so much of that will start from a two high look pre-snap. And so and both of those guys, they kind of use Adderley and James pretty interchangeably at the safety spot. And so you don't quite know who's going to be the guy that rolls down, who's going to be the guy that stays in the post. Both guys have done it at a high level. I would say more likely Adderley is going to stay in the post and more likely James rolls down, but they're perfectly fine with both guys playing from depth. And so that's been really interesting just to watch the way that they've been able to use that disguise element on the back end of that defense. Just watching them though last week, I just kind of came away thinking like it's a lot of the same things thematically that what we've seen here from this Eagles defense, right? Where you're going to play a lot of softer zone coverage for the most part. Again, as you mentioned, there were games where they'll play a heavy amount of man, but when you look at it, it's going to be a lot of lighter boxes. There were times where you see Joey Bosa lined up often as a 4-eye technique on early downs. And so that's been talked about with the Eagles, right? And Josh Sweat lining up inside. It's just a lot of the same things. There's just some slight tweaks here and there, but it's been interesting to watch just with what the Chargers have.
Well, they do play a lot of 5-man fronts. They play a lot of 5-1 nickel.
Yep.
They also play 4-2 nickel. In many ways, it's what the Eagles do.
Eagles do, sure.
It's not surprising because, as many know, Brandon Staley and Jonathan Gannon are best friends. So I'm sure they spend a lot of time in the offseason, probably not this week, but a lot of times in the offseason talking ball. So you do see some of the same principles. Staley's played a lot more man coverage, cover one, than the Eagles have, but he may feel he has the players who can line up and do that.
Sure. Well, let's talk about some of the personnel. You mentioned Derwin James earlier, just an X factor for that defense with everything that he can do. A player that has the ability to cover so much ground, not just sideline to sideline, but also downhill. And I know that he has spoken about this publicly. Brandon Staley and others that have been close to him in the media have kind of talked about this. But their willingness to play with some of these later boxes, because if you've got Derwin James playing from depth, what might be a 5 or 6 man box pre-snap becomes a 6 or 7 man box very fast. So those numbers kind of work back in your favor very soon after the snap.
Well, Brandon Staley is also a believer that the explosive plays in the NFL tend to come from the pass game, which percentage-wise is 100% true.
Yep.
And that you should structure your initial look to stop the pass and play the run, not play the run on the fly, but that you react to the run, that it's the run theoretically. Again, this is every game does play out differently, but the run theoretically, Fran, is not what's going to beat you. If a team wants to hand the ball off, let them hand the ball off. Obviously, you don't want them to gain 15, 20 yards with each run, but percentage-wise, that does not happen. So, you add into the run, as Derwin James can do, but you defend the pass first.
And James, with just how impressively versatile he plays a number of positions for them, does so much for them in that defense.
How about that interception he made when he was man-to-man on Darren Waller?
It was a Monday Night Football game a few weeks ago. It was a week 4, week 3, and it was late in the game, crunch time. The Raiders are threatening here. They've started to build some momentum offensively, and James comes up with a huge interception in man-to-man against Darren Waller on a sail route, which, hey, we've seen Dallas Goedert run that sail route a handful of times over these last few weeks for big gains. So an easily translatable play for this matchup.
Yeah, so, obviously the player who I know came out Sunday with a hamstring, who's actually very important to them, and a hamstring normally does not go away in a week, is Mike Davis.
Yeah.
He might not be a household name, Fran, but I've seen every one of their games this year on the coaching tape, and he's their boundary corner, and they don't move him. The week they played the Chiefs, he lined up against Travis Kelce. They don't move him, so he plays boundary corner, and he's a really critical piece to their defense. And if he can't go, again, I'm not Brandon Staley, so I'm not going to sit here and say, what are they going to do now? But he's a really important piece.
No doubt. And filling out the rest of that secondary just in the corner room. Asante Samuel Jr., the team's second-round pick. He's starting on one side. You've got Chris Harris starting in the nickel. He shifted outside after the injury to Davis. So that would be something to watch here in this game for certain. Thoughts on Asante Samuel Jr., obviously a name that a lot of Eagles fans are familiar with just because of his father, obviously. But thoughts on what you've seen from him so far in his rookie year?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied him in detail, but I think he's been pretty solid. A couple of players other than Samuel have stood out to me on tape. I think Kaiser White, who's a linebacker, who was a safety, I believe at West Virginia, was not.
Yep.
Yeah. I think he stands out. I think he's got some juice to him. I think he moves laterally well. I think he's got some physicality to him. So he's a player that I notice. I think their defense has some good players, and it's probably still coming together. I remember talking to some offensive coaches this summer who said that Brandon Staley is very, very multiple with what he does. So you can imagine that coming in as a new coach with a new team, that it probably takes time for all that to come together. So there's going to be games where it doesn't all come together and they give up some chunks. Yeah. And, over time, it'll get better and better. But they do have some solid individual players for sure.
Yeah, and looking up front, I mean, when you've got Joey Bosa, one of the best individual talents off the edge in the NFL, Jerry Tillery has the ability to be extremely disruptive. Drew Tranquill, when he's healthy, the linebacker from Notre Dame, former 4th-round pick, he was a converted college safety as well. Very active in their pressure schemes, and they do a lot. And for me, I would say one thing that impressed me watching this defense over the course of the season has been that when it gets to passing downs, they're pretty creative with what they do. And it's not always going to result in a blitz, in a 5-man pressure. It might be a 4-man look, but you've got guys moving around and standing up in different spots and rushing from different angles. You don't always know who's coming and who's not. Right. And so you see all these guys, whether it's, the Bosas, the Tillerys, the Uchenna Nwosus, they'll mix in a Chris Rumpf every once in a while. Christian Covington getting some good snaps for them inside at D tackle. Tranquill, as I mentioned, Kaiser White, when he's in there, a big part of their pressure package. So they move all these guys around. Kyler Fackrell in on the action. So all these guys are a big part of it, and you just don't always know who's coming and who's not. And I think that's one thing that has stood out is schematically they do some good things from a pressure package standpoint up front.
And I think you'll see that this week. Yeah. Because we know that Jalen Hurts does still have a tendency as a young quarterback to react prematurely. If he perceives pressure or anticipates that it might be coming, he can break down in the pocket. And so I think you will absolutely see that this week against the Eagles.
Yeah, it'll be certainly a big element to watch in this game. Greg, we'll be back next week to break it all down with you right here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. Thanks once again for joining us here on Chalk Talk.
Thanks, Fran.
The Philadelphia Eagles, a new era, introduced the Fly Collection, an elevated, boldly branded apparel capsule with streetwear appeal that's different from your standard Eagles fan gear. The collection sees bold new graphic expressions of the Eagles brand on apparel essentials like hoodies, t-shirts, jackets,
and headwear. The designs are kept simple, mixing fresh, modern branding alongside bold punches of color, available exclusively at all Philadelphia Eagles Pro Shop locations and the team's official online store. Learn more and view the entire capsule at PhiladelphiaEagles.com/fly.
Now it's time to hear from you, the fans, in the Draft Mailbag.
Great stuff from Greg, who you can follow on Twitter, just like I do, at Greg Cosell. And while you're at it, I'm at EaglesXOs. That's where I post all the podcasts I'm a part of and all of our X's and O's content that we produce here with Eagles Entertainment. And you know how much I appreciate everybody that promotes this podcast on any form of social media. But the best way to throw us your support is to go into Apple Podcasts or to Stitcher, leave us a rating or leave us a comment. I wanted to give a shout out today to someone who did exactly that. Weissa later went onto our Apple Podcast page and left a 5-star review late last week. So before this game against the Lions, and said, Jonathan Gannon runs a scheme that predominantly asks the defensive line to hold blocks and penetrate less than Jim Schwartz asked. The linebackers appear to be covering more ground because the safeties have been stationed deeper. It works for other teams like the Colts and the Bills. My sense is that our personnel is not suited for this. We have not forced one fumble this year as a result of a strip or a big hit. This defense only works if you cause disruptions while the other offense matriculates down the field. Am I reading this wrong? And will there be more pressure to run a more aggressive scheme, even though it's not necessarily Gannon's preference due to the personnel? So Weissa later, obviously, look, we saw some of the big plays the Eagles defense made this week, but I'm going to go this off of what you said late last week after that Raiders game. And I think, the big thing to remember, you talked about a couple defenses there with the Colts and the Bills. And anytime you were going to run a defense, not just, I shouldn't even say just a zone coverage defense, but really any defense, it's hard to come in year one and institute exactly what you want to do and get 100% execution across the board on the defensive side of the football, because defense is already hard enough to play in the NFL. It's very, very difficult. That's why you will say, when you look at who the top defenses are one year, it's very hard to sustain that year over year over year, because defense is hard to play in the league, especially with the way that it's set up right now. So I think when you look at this defense, keep in mind, you mentioned the Colts, you mentioned the Bills. When you look in year one of Matt Eberflus out in Indianapolis, when you look at year one and Sean McDermott and Leslie Frazier out in Buffalo, those defenses, look, it came along a little bit slowly, right? And so I think that's something, just a little bit more patience. We saw some good things from the Eagles defense here this Sunday. We don't know if that's going to sustain moving forward. That's going to be an every week occurrence, but you just need to give a little bit of time. Let it marinate a little bit, especially when you play a lot of zone. When you're talking about the space the linebackers have to cover, working with the safeties, working with the nickel corner. All that stuff is a feel thing. It's an experience thing. It's a communication thing. So just getting down to reps with those kinds of situations, all that stuff will work itself out as the team continues to add bodies to that side of the football. So that would be what I would say, is just give that side time. Defense is really difficult in this game, and I think that's something that we should just keep in mind as we're watching this defense continue to grow. So great question there from Weissa later. Hope that answered that question. Thank you, and thank you as well to everybody out there for your continued support of this show and all the rest of our podcast offerings here with Eagles Entertainment. All that being said, I think that'll do it. Another show in the books here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. For everybody here at the NovaCare Complex, I am Fran Duffy. We will talk to you later this week.